Ordinary grocery runs aren't supposed to turn lethal, but everything can change in a single heartbeat. Shoving his service weapon into the chest of a black shopper, a power-hungry rookie fully believed he was establishing dominance. He had absolutely no clue he had just drawn his gun on a decorated FBI agent. The fluorescent lights of the Oak Ridge Fresh Market hummed with a low, steady drone. It was 7:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of quiet suburban evening where the most pressing issue usually involved choosing between paper and plastic. Special Agent Dean Hastings stood in aisle 4, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He wasn't analyzing a crime scene or dissecting the psychological profile of a domestic terrorist. He was trying to decide between a superhero-themed ice cream cake and a traditional triple chocolate fudge cake for his daughter's 9th birthday. Dean was a 20-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, currently heading up a specialized organized crime task force in the region. To the rest of the world on this particular evening, however, he was just a tired father in faded grey sweatpants, a dark blue Georgetown University hoodie, and worn-out running shoes. He had left his suit and tie at the field office, seeking only the anonymity and comfort of civilian clothes after a grueling 14-hour shift. 2 aisles over, Officer Thomasin Grisham of the Oak Ridge Police Department was pacing the linoleum floors with a restless, aggressive energy. Grisham had been on the force for exactly 2 years, a tenure marked by a trail of civilian complaints that had been swept under the rug by an overwhelmed internal affairs department. He was a man who wore his badge not as a shield for the public, but as a crown. Earlier that evening, a call had come over the radio regarding a petty theft at a nearby electronics store. The suspect was described vaguely as a tall black male wearing a dark hoodie. Grisham hadn't been dispatched to the call, but he liked to insert himself where he wasn't needed. As he strolled past the bakery section, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered service weapon, he spotted Dean. Dean was 6'2", broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark hoodie. For Grisham, the vague radio description was all the justification he needed. The officer didn't see a father buying a birthday cake. He saw an opportunity to play the hero, fueled by a deeply ingrained bias he didn't even bother to hide. "Hey, you!" Grisham barked, his voice echoing sharply against the canned goods. Dean, holding the chocolate cake, didn't immediately register that the command was directed at him. He turned slightly, spotting the uniformed officer closing the distance between them with heavy, purposeful strides. "I'm talking to you. Put the item down and take your hands out of your pockets," Grisham ordered, coming to a halt about 6 feet away. Dean's instincts, honed by decades of high-stakes undercover work and tactical training, immediately assessed the situation. He noted Grisham's bladed stance, the twitch in his jaw, and the unmistakable hostility in his eyes. Dean placed the cake gently on the frozen display glass and slowly raised his empty hands, keeping them visible. "Can I help you, officer?" Dean asked, his voice calm, deep and steady. He intentionally kept his tone devoid of challenge. De-escalation was step 1. "What are you doing in here?" Grisham demanded, his eyes darting over Dean's casual attire. He sneered slightly. "This is a high-end market. You lost?" Dean felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had faced down cartel enforcers and white-collar sociopaths, but the sting of everyday, blatant racism never entirely lost its bite. "I'm buying a birthday cake for my daughter, officer. Is there a problem?" "The problem is you match the description of a suspect who just robbed the Best Buy down the street," Grisham lied. The actual robbery was across town, and the suspect was reportedly much younger. But Grisham was already committed to his narrative. "I need to see your ID. I understand you're doing your job," Dean replied evenly. though his eyes locked onto Grisham's with a piercing intensity. "But I haven't been near an electronics store today. I'm just here for groceries. Am I being detained?" The question, a fundamental assertion of civil rights, hit Grisham like a physical blow. Cops like Grisham despised citizens who knew their rights. It challenged their absolute authority. Grisham's face flushed red, the veins in his neck bulging against his tight uniform collar. "You're being detained the second I say you are, pal," Grisham spat, stepping into Dean's personal space. The smell of cheap cologne and stale coffee wafted from him. "Now give me your ID before I put you on the ground and take it from you." Several shoppers had stopped their carts at the end of the aisle. Sarah Jenkins, a teenage cashier on her break, had already pulled out her smartphone, the red record button blinking. Gregory Finch, the balding, middle-aged store manager, was hovering nervously near the end cap of aisle 4, wringing his hands, but too intimidated by the police uniform to intervene. Dean knew he was walking a razor's edge. He carried his badge and his concealed weapon, a Glock 19, in an inside holster beneath his hoodie. He knew that reaching for his wallet, which was right next to his firearm, could be a fatal move with an officer this agitated. "Officer," Dean said, dropping his voice an octave, projecting pure, unadulterated authority. "I am going to comply, but you need to take a breath and lower your voice. You are creating a panic in a public space." "Don't you tell me how to do my job," Grisham shouted, losing whatever fragile grip he had on his professionalism. He reached out and forcefully shoved Dean's shoulder. Dean barely moved, his center of gravity solid, but the physical contact crossed a massive legal and tactical line. Dean's eyes narrowed. "Do not touch me again." Grisham's ego snapped. In one fluid, practiced, and entirely unjustified motion, he unholstered his 9mm sidearm and leveled it directly at Dean's chest. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet grocery store. Screams erupted from the front of the store. A woman dropped a glass jar of pasta sauce, the shattering sound echoing loudly as red pooled on the white floor. "On the ground! Face down! Now!" Grisham roared, his hands shaking slightly on the grip of his pistol. Time slowed down for Dean Hastings. The adrenaline dumped into his bloodstream, but his heart rate remained remarkably controlled. He looked past the black barrel of the gun, straight into Thomasin Grisham's wide, erratic eyes. He saw no fear in the officer. He saw only the intoxicating, dangerous high of absolute power. "Officer," Dean said, his voice cutting through the panic of the screaming bystanders like a knife. "You have drawn your service weapon on an unarmed man in a crowded supermarket. Your finger is on the trigger. You need to holster your weapon immediately." "Shut up and get on the ground," Grisham screamed, his voice cracking. He stepped closer, the muzzle of the gun now less than 2 feet from Dean's heart. "I will shoot you. Give me a reason, tough guy. Give me a reason." Sarah Jenkins, the cashier, was crying silently as she filmed, terrified she was about to witness a murder. Gregory Finch, the manager, was frantically dialing 911 behind a display of potato chips. Dean knew that going to the ground was not an option. Surrendering control to an unstable, armed individual in a heightened state of panic was a recipe for a negligent discharge. He had to end this, and he had to end it now. "I am not getting on the ground," Dean stated, his tone absolute. He didn't yell, he didn't plead, he commanded. "My name is Dean Hastings. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My credentials are in my left inner jacket pocket." Grisham blinked, the words stalling his momentum for a fraction of a second. But the officer's pride refused to let him back down. "Bullshit! You're lying! Keep your hands where I can see them." "I'm going to slowly reach into my left pocket with my left hand," Dean announced, moving with agonizing slowness. He telegraphed every millimeter of his movement. "I am retrieving my wallet. My badge is attached to the front of it." "Stop!" Grisham yelled, but his finger hesitated on the trigger. Deep down, a sliver of doubt had finally penetrated his ego. Dean's hand slipped inside his hoodie. He grasped the leather wallet, feeling the heavy, cold metal of his FBI shield on the outside. He pulled it out smoothly, flipping it open and holding it up at eye level. The gold DOJ shield caught the harsh fluorescent light, gleaming brilliantly. Next to it was his official identification card, bearing his stern photograph and the bold letters, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Grisham stared at the badge. His mind struggled to process the visual information. The narrative he had constructed, the thug he was going to heroically arrest, crumbled into dust. But instead of holstering his weapon and apologizing, the cognitive dissonance made him double down. "That's a fake," Grisham stammered, though his gun barrel dipped slightly. "You bought that online. Get on the floor." "Officer Grisham," Dean read the nameplate on the man's chest. "If you do not holster your weapon in the next 3 seconds, you will not only be facing federal civil rights charges, but you will be spending the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary for assaulting a federal agent. 1, 2... Grisham, drop your weapon, now!" The booming voice came from the front of the aisle, carrying a weight and authority that made Grisham physically flinch. Standing there was Robert Miller, the chief of police for the Oak Ridge PD. Miller was a heavily built man with silver hair and a deeply lined face. He was dressed in plain clothes, a button-down shirt and khakis, having just finished dinner at the restaurant next door when he heard the commotion and the panicked screams from the market. Chief Miller had his own weapon drawn, held at the low ready, but his eyes were fixed entirely on his own officer. As Miller closed the distance, he looked past the gun and saw the man Grisham was holding at gunpoint. Miller's stomach dropped. He knew Dean Hastings well. They had coordinated a massive joint agency human trafficking bust just 6 months prior. He knew Dean's character, his record, and the fact that the man holding the gold shield was one of the most respected agents in the state. "Chief," Grisham stuttered, looking over his shoulder, his gun wavering. "Holster that weapon right this second, Thomasin, or so help me God, I will drop you where you stand." Chief Miller growled, his voice a lethal whisper that promised absolute ruin. Grisham, finally realizing the totality of his catastrophic mistake, shakily engaged the safety and dropped the gun back into its holster. He took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. "Chief," he matched a description. "He was resisting." Chief Miller ignored him. He holstered his own weapon and walked straight up to Dean. "Agent Hastings," Miller said, his face pale with a mixture of fury and profound embarrassment. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Bob," Dean replied, lowering his badge but keeping his eyes locked on Grisham. "Though I think your officer needs a refresher on use of force protocols and the Fourth Amendment." Miller turned slowly to face Grisham. The young officer looked like a deflated balloon. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by the pale, clammy look of a man watching his life evaporate. "Chief, I was just doing my job," Grisham pleaded, his voice whining. "He wouldn't show me his ID. He got aggressive." "Shut your mouth," Miller said, his voice vibrating with rage. He looked around, noting the dozen cell phones recording the entire exchange. He knew this was going to be a national headline by morning, but more than the PR nightmare, Miller was disgusted by the blatant racist entitlement his officer had just displayed. "Thomasin Grisham," Chief Miller said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the frozen food section. "You are a disgrace to that uniform. Give me your badge. Give me your gun." Grisham's eyes widened in horror. "Chief, wait. We can go back to the precinct and talk about this." "There is no talking," Miller snapped, stepping into Grisham's space, radiating fury. "You just pulled a firearm on a federal agent over a grocery run. You racially profiled a man, escalated a situation without cause, and threatened lethal force. Give me your duty belt, now." Trembling, Grisham unbuckled his heavy leather duty belt. The heavy thud of the belt hitting the linoleum floor echoed in the quiet store. He reached up and unpinned the silver star from his chest, handing it over with a shaking hand. "You are fired, effective immediately," Chief Miller stated coldly, taking the badge. "And as of this moment, you are a civilian under criminal investigation. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Grisham gasped. "What? Bob, please." "That's Chief Miller to you. And I said hands behind your back." Miller pulled a pair of handcuffs from his own belt. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Agent Hastings, I assume the Bureau will want to press federal charges as well." "You can count on it," Dean said quietly, finally picking up the chocolate cake he had set down minutes ago. As Chief Miller clicked the cuffs around Grisham's wrists, a spontaneous round of applause broke out from the shoppers who had witnessed the ordeal. Sarah Jenkins lowered her phone, her hands shaking, knowing the footage she'd just captured was about to shake the town to its core. But for Dean Hastings, the victory felt hollow. He looked at the disgraced cop being led away, knowing that if he didn't have that gold shield in his pocket, he might not have been walking out of that supermarket at all. By the time the sun rose over the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge the following morning, the town was no longer a sleepy suburb. It was the epicenter of a national firestorm. Sarah Jenkins, still trembling from the adrenaline of the night before, had uploaded her shaky, unedited smartphone footage to 3 different social media platforms before she even clocked out of her shift. She didn't add a sensational caption. She simply wrote, "Oak Ridge cop pulls gun on off-duty FBI agent buying a cake." The internet did the rest. Within 6 hours, the video had crossed 10 million views. Major cable news networks were looping the footage, dissecting every terrifying second. Pundits analyzed the bladed stance of the officer, the aggressive shove, and the chilling metallic click of the safety being disengaged. But what resonated most with the public, what turned a spark into an absolute inferno, was the stark, undeniable contrast between Officer Thomasin Grisham's unhinged hostility and Special Agent Dean Hastings's ice-cold, methodical composure. While the media circus pitched its tents on the manicured lawn of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Thomasin Grisham was experiencing a very different kind of morning. He was sitting in a windowless, concrete holding cell at the county jail, wearing a faded orange jumpsuit that smelled faintly of industrial bleach. His hands were still trembling. The heavy steel door clanked open, and a man in an ill-fitting grey suit walked in, slapping a leather briefcase onto the metal table. It was Brendan Shaw, the senior representative for the Regional Police Union. Grisham looked up, his bloodshot eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Brendan, thank God," Grisham breathed, leaning forward. "You got to get me out of here. Miller lost his mind. He stripped my badge in public. They can't do that without a hearing. The union has to file an injunction." Shaw didn't sit down. He didn't open his briefcase. He just stared at Grisham with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "Tommy," Shaw said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, "I'm not here to represent you. I'm here as a courtesy to tell you that the union is officially severing all ties with you. We are not funding your defense. We are not filing a grievance. You are entirely on your own." Grisham's jaw dropped. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the harsh fluorescent lights. "What? You can't do that. I pay my dues. I was acting on a suspect description. You pulled a loaded firearm on a decorated federal agent over a grocery store dispute and threatened to murder him on camera," Shaw snapped, his temper finally flaring. "You racially profiled a man who has taken down international cartels. You broke half a dozen department policies, violated his civil rights, and you made every single cop in this state look like a trigger-happy thug. Do you have any idea the hellfire coming down on this department right now?" Before Grisham could stammer out a defense, Shaw leaned over the table, lowering his voice to a grave whisper. "Chief Miller didn't just arrest you, Tommy. He handed you over. The Department of Justice took jurisdiction at 4 a.m. You aren't facing local assault charges anymore. You're facing federal indictment. Good luck." Shaw turned and walked out, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that made Grisham physically jump. The union rep wasn't exaggerating. The DOJ did not take kindly to local law enforcement threatening their agents. By noon, a team of federal investigators, led by a notoriously relentless civil rights prosecutor named Cynthia Reynolds, had descended upon Oak Ridge. Reynolds didn't just want to prosecute Grisham for the supermarket incident. She wanted to know how a man so clearly unsuited for a badge had been allowed to wear one for 2 years. She immediately subpoenaed Grisham's entire personnel file, bypassing the local internal affairs division entirely. What the federal investigators uncovered was a shocking pattern of buried corruption. The supermarket incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the inevitable climax of unchecked power. Grisham's file contained 14 civilian complaints in just 24 months, most of them from minority residents alleging excessive force, unlawful detention, and verbal abuse. All of them had been summarily dismissed by a former, recently retired IA captain. But the DOJ dug deeper. As part of the federal probe, they executed a search warrant on Grisham's locker at the precinct and his personal residence. Behind a false panel in his gym locker, FBI agents found a stash of unregistered burner phones, 3 bags of evidence-grade narcotics that had gone missing from a bust 6 months prior, and nearly $8,000 in cash banded in small denominations. Grisham hadn't just been a racist bully. He had been shaking down local dealers, using his badge to steal cash and drugs, and terrorizing the neighborhoods he was sworn to protect. When Dean Hastings heard the news from his own bureau director, he felt a cold satisfaction. He had known the moment Grisham looked at him with those dead, power-hungry eyes that the man was dirty. Now the whole world was going to know. 9 months later, the circus had moved from the supermarket to the United States District Court. The air in the courtroom was stifling, thick with the tension of a trial that had captivated the nation. Thomasin Grisham sat at the defense table, a shadow of the arrogant rookie who had stalked the aisles of the Oak Ridge Fresh Market. He had lost 30 pounds. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and his hair had thinned dramatically. The swagger was gone, replaced by the nervous, twitchy energy of a cornered animal. His high-priced defense attorney, Arthur Gable, paid for by a second mortgage Grisham's parents had to take out on their home, had tried desperately to negotiate a plea deal. But Cynthia Reynolds, representing the full weight of the federal government, had refused. They didn't want a quiet plea. They wanted a public reckoning. Grisham was facing multiple federal charges: deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, evidence tampering, and extortion. The trial was a systematic dismantling of Grisham's life and character. Reynolds brought forward the victims of Grisham's past shakedowns, young men who had been too terrified to speak out against a cop, but who now found their courage with the backing of the FBI. But the pinnacle of the trial was the testimony of Special Agent Dean Hastings. When Dean took the stand, The courtroom fell into a dead, reverent silence. He wore a sharp, charcoal-grey suit, his gold FBI shield clipped securely to his belt, visible to the jury. He looked every inch the seasoned, authoritative federal investigator he was. Under direct examination by Reynolds, Dean recounted the events of that evening with chilling precision. He didn't embellish. He didn't show anger. He simply laid out the tactical, legal, and psychological realities of the encounter. "Agent Hastings?" Reynolds asked, pacing slowly before the jury box. "When the defendant pointed his service weapon at your chest, what was your professional assessment of his state of mind?" "He was operating purely on ego and bias," Dean answered, his deep voice carrying clearly across the room. He locked eyes with Grisham, who immediately looked down at his lap. He was not responding to a threat. He was creating one to justify his desire to exert dominance over a civilian he deemed subordinate. "In my 20 years in law enforcement, I have rarely seen a more dangerous combination of cowardice and authority." Gable, the defense attorney, tried to rattle Dean during cross-examination, suggesting that Dean's refusal to immediately lie face down on the ground constituted resisting a lawful order. "Agent Hastings, surely you know that when a police officer issues a command, you are expected to comply, regardless of whether you feel the stop is justified in the moment?" Gable pushed, adjusting his glasses. Dean leaned slightly into the microphone. "Counselor, an unlawful order given by an officer operating outside the bounds of the Constitution does not require compliance, particularly when that compliance puts my life in imminent danger. Had I gone to the ground and reached for my credentials, Officer Grisham's finger was trembling on the trigger. He lacked the trigger discipline and emotional control required to handle a firearm safely. Surrendering to a panicked armed man is a tactical error I do not make." The jury hung on his every word. The defense's narrative shattered against the bedrock of Dean's expertise. When the prosecution finally played the video from the supermarket on the large screens in the courtroom, the impact was visceral. Even though everyone had seen it on the news, watching it in the sterile environment of a federal court, knowing the man on the screen was sitting just feet away, made it all the more horrifying. The sharp click of the gun's safety echoing through the speakers made several jurors flinch. The deliberation was astonishingly brief. It took the federal jury less than 4 hours to return. The courtroom was pin-drop quiet as the forewoman stood up. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant, Thomasin Grisham, guilty." Grisham closed his eyes, his breath hitching as a ragged sob escaped his throat. "On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. On the charge of evidence tampering, guilty. On the charge of extortion, guilty." The gavel fell, sounding like a coffin nailing shut. 2 weeks later, Judge Harrison delivered the final, crushing blow during sentencing. He looked down at Grisham from the bench, his expression one of absolute contempt. "Mr. Grisham, you were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you used them as tools to terrorize your community, feed your own prejudice, and line your pockets," Judge Harrison stated, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "You are a predator who hid behind a uniform. The fact that you pulled a weapon on a federal agent is the only reason you were caught, which leaves me shuddering to think what you would have eventually done to an ordinary citizen who had no gold shield to protect them." The judge adjusted his robes. "I sentence you to 144 months, 12 years, in federal prison. You will serve this time without the possibility of early parole. You are forever barred from holding any position of public trust, and your state pension is hereby revoked." As the U.S. Marshals approached Grisham to take him into custody, the disgraced cop looked back into the gallery. He wasn't looking for his family. He was looking for Dean Hastings. Dean was standing in the back row, his arms crossed. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He merely gave a slow, imperceptible nod as the heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around Grisham's wrists. The cold click of the cuffs was the exact same sound Grisham's gun safety had made in the supermarket. The symmetry of the moment was a brutal, poetic testament to karma. Grisham was led out of the courtroom, destined for a federal facility where former corrupt cops were placed in solitary confinement for their own protection. A 6-by-8-foot concrete box where he would spend the next 12 years thinking about a grocery store aisle and a chocolate cake. Later that evening, Dean Hastings walked into his own home. The scent of a home-cooked meal drifted from the kitchen. His daughter Maya came running down the hallway, throwing her arms around his waist. "Daddy, you're home," she cheered. Dean smiled, a genuine warm expression that erased the hard lines of his job, wrapping his arms around his daughter and kissing the top of her head. "I'm home, sweetie," Dean said, holding her just a little tighter than usual. He looked over at the dining room table. Sitting in the center, next to a stack of brightly wrapped presents, was the remains of a triple chocolate fudge cake. It was a simple, everyday object. But to Dean, it represented a profound victory. He had faced the darkest, ugliest side of authority, and he had broken it. The system was flawed, yes, but on this day, justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered with the full, unrelenting force of a hurricane. Karma always collects its debts, and for Thomasin Grisham, the ultimate price was 12 long years in a federal cell. True justice prevails when the truth is brought to light, proving that a badge is never a shield for race